What happens when a family gathers to sort through a dead man's estate and uncover secrets no one was ready for? Find out in Appropriate, now playing at the Olney Theater Center. From Tony Award-winning playwright Brendan Jacobs Jenkins, critics have called Appropriate part family sitcom, part sibling deathmatch, part socio-political gut punch, and a masterclass in gritty, unrestrained performance. Audiences are loving it too, so much so that it's been extended through April 26th. But seats are going fast, so don't miss it. Visit onlytheater.org to grab yours before they're gone.
The French have a phrase, joie de vivre, the joy of living. Alliance Française brings that joy through French language classes, culture, and community straight to you. Classes start May 2nd, but first, try a free Zoom class the week of April 20th. No commitment, no excuses. Early bird pricing ends April 17th. Visit francedc.org and sign up today. Today on CityCast DC, have you ever wanted to be one of those people who can tell a Georgian DC row house from a federal DC row house, or who can drop the name of Harry Wardman? Then settle in, because I got to spend a half hour chatting with Joe Himmeley. He makes his living as a real estate guy, but you might know him from his strangely addictive social media posts about DC architecture. All kinds of people these days talk about the way official Washington looks, but Himmeley explains why our actual houses look the way they do. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Today is Wednesday, April 8th. I'm Michael Schaefer. Here's what DC's talking about. Hey, Joe, thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So listen, this is a year when there's been a lot of talk about DC architecture, mostly around sort of the federal core, what kind of buildings the government should put up, et cetera. There's been a lot less conversation about the different architectural styles of residential DC. Those of the administration has left those alone for now.
Indeed.
But it made me think, like, I'm kind of an ignoramus about them. And your social media presence, you do a lot of sort of touring of people through neighborhoods and pointing out what kind of buildings they have and why they're there, which is what I'm pumped to talk to you about today.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm excited to be here and talk about it.
So for folks who don't know, let's assume they're as dumb as me on architecture. What are the main architectural styles that we see or should be accustomed to seeing in residential DC?
So I think that the styles that you'd think of that are most well-known is that if you look in Georgetown, it's most well-known for Federal style in particular, Federal and Georgian. You'll also have some Victorianism in there, but generally Federal and Georgian is what you'll see there. DuPont is mostly known for Victorians and also some Beaux-Arts. And then you'll see Logan Circle, which is really known for its Victorian architecture. It's probably the highest level of Victorian architecture in the city. You'll have Capitol Hill. Again, that's a mix of Federal, Georgian, and Victorian styles. You can look up in a neighborhood like Cleveland Park, and there you'll find the Sherman Cottage, and you'll also find there a lot of sort of exuberant architecture, really high Victorianism as well, but detached, not row houses. You look at a neighborhood like Petworth, and you'll find a lot of the porch front houses in that neighborhood. Or if you go down to a neighborhood like Anacostia, you'll see a lot of Victorian row houses, a lot of Federal row houses, and some porch fronts down there as well. So different neighborhoods definitely have different feels. Oh, and then, of course, a place like Chevy Chase will have a lot of Center Hall colonials. That's what it's known for. Particularly American University Park is really well known for Center Hall and Side Hall colonials. So different neighborhoods definitely have different feels. And as people do their home searches and they find out what styles they like, they can then choose neighborhoods that were built at a time when those styles were most prevalent.
So then what is Georgian architecture and where can I find that?
Well, I think that if you think about the architectural styles in Washington, you can think about it over time. And the initial architectural style that was most prevalent in our area was something called Georgian. And Georgian architecture is generally known for red brick and symmetry. So you would have a symmetrical facade. It would be mirror image on either side of the door. It was not terribly well ornamented, meaning it didn't have a lot of extraneous details added onto it. And that was prevalent. And you can see a lot of that in Georgetown in particular within the District of Columbia, some original Georgian-style buildings.
Right about when were those built?
So those were starting in the Georgian period, the English Georgian period, which would be in the 1700s, so early 1700s. And it went through the different King Georges. Of course, during the Revolutionary War period, it was King George. So that was a period where you'll see a lot of that sort of architectural style built. And we've seen a revival of that when the most common architectural style in the suburbs of Washington is called the Center Hall Colonial. The Center Hall Colonial is a sort of interpretation, a modernized interpretation of a Georgian style house.
So like if a Georgian style house had a suburban yard.
Yeah, exactly. And was detached, because a lot of times within the city, they would not be detached because there wasn't enough space. But yeah, absolutely.
Wait, so I hear a lot about the federal style, but what you've said about Georgian seems to be the same way a lot of people describe that. What's the difference?
That's actually very interesting, because the federal style came about during the federal period, which is the period between the initial start of the United States and the new Constitution. And so a federal style building is basically the same as a Georgian style, but with slightly more ornamentation. Generally, the biggest differential between a Georgian and a federal is the federal will have a fan light. A fan light is a window above the door that's sort of shaped in a fan or a semicircle, and then we'll have side lights. Side lights are two small windows on either side, so they sort of run the length of the door. So the door will have a little bit more decoration in particular. It will generally be a little bit lighter than Georgian style. But the reality is that it was really the Georgian style still. But the United States wanted to show it's not part of the Georgian style anymore, which was related back to the old world. And they wanted to show the new federal United States. And that's where that term comes from.
Is that also stuff you see in Georgetown?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that realistically, most people can't tell the difference between Georgian and federal. And I think a lot of architectural historians would look at two buildings and some would categorize it as Georgian and others as federal. But if it has the fan light and the side lights on the door, that will be called a federal, as opposed to just a flat top, which would be called Georgian.
See, I feel smarter already.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you.
Let's go through the styles a little bit more. What about Gothic? What's that?
You know, architecture has fads and has different styles that become prevalent over time. And the Georgian style slowly sort of fell out of favor, became stodgy. And then we had a movement towards the Gothic style. Gothic would be a style where it's most commonly associated with churches. And you'll see the Gothic style will have a pointed arch as opposed to a round arch or a flat top around a window. So that pointed arch is sort of the most important aspect of the Gothic style building. So if you see that pointed arch, you're almost, not guaranteed, but almost guaranteed to be a Gothic style building. And Gothic would also have in it the quadrifoil and trefoil shape, which is sort of looks like a 3-leaf or 4-leaf clover would be attached in there as well.
Where do I find those in DC?
Well, in particular, you'll see that on the National Cathedral, which is a classic Gothic style building. But there are other buildings in the city like the Chastleton, which is on 16th Street or 17th Street. And it's a apartment building that was built in the 1920s. And that particular style you'll find it there. You'll also find it in places like Oak Hill Cemetery. You'll find it there. And you'll see some
That's a place I don't want to move anytime soon.
No, nobody wants to move in there anytime soon. So those are the places where you would see a lot of the Gothic style. There's not a lot of Gothic houses per se in DC, but the Gothic revival and that sort of movement towards that style is something that was important in DC.
The late congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis has always been one of my personal heroes. Maybe you've even seen that beautiful mural celebrating him in Southeast. So I will definitely be honoring his spirit and legacy at one of the hottest shows of the spring that is already selling out fast. Young John Lewis, Prodigy of Protest, is the electrifying new hip-hop musical taking over the Atlas Performing Arts Center, with over 15 performances already sold out. From award-winning DC playwright Soul Miami 24 and Grammy-nominated Kokai, this is the untold origin story of a true legend. They are taking it back before he was a congressman, back before he made history. Young John Lewis, Prodigy of Protest, plays March 26th through May 3rd at the Atlas Performing Arts Center. Get your tickets at mosaictheater.org and I will see you there. Life can change faster than DC's seasons. One moment, everything feels normal, and next, your world is turned upside down. So don't let someone else's mistake ruin your spring. Call the team you can count on. NACE Law Group has been standing up for DC families for decades, fighting for neighbors hurt by medical malpractice, wrongful death, and serious injuries. They don't just settle quickly or push papers. They dig in, fight hard, and make sure every client gets the justice they deserve. And here is something that I love. They are a longtime supporter of CityCast because just like us, they really care about this community and the folks who call it home. So if you or someone that you care about has been hurt, don't wait. Call NACE Law Group. They'll stand with you, fight for your family, and make sure your rights are protected so that you can focus on what matters most.
Spring is here, and it is finally that rare time of year in DC when it's neither too cold nor too hellishly hot to open your windows. So don't miss out. Window Nation's The More You Buy, The More You Save sale is going on now. You could save up to 50% off all windows for your home. Window Nation's installation crews finish the job in 1 day or less, so you can enjoy the breeze with minimal disruption. Best of all, they offer a lifetime warranty on all their windows, so you can relax knowing your home is protected far into the future. Hurry! This sale ends soon. Schedule a fast free consultation now at windownation.com. All right, other styles in DC. What about Romanesque? Where's that?
So Romanesque. I love Romanesque revival style. In particular, the best place to see that is the 1700 block of Q Street Northwest in DuPont Circle. If you go down that street, you'll see a lot of buildings. And the difference between Romanesque revival and Gothic, the most important thing is to look at the arch. So again, with the Gothic, you'd have a pointed arch, but with a Romanesque revival, it would have what's called a Roman arch. A Roman arch means a half circle arch. So it's perfectly circular, sort of cut in half, and that would be a Roman arch. And you'll see Roman arches on places that are related to the Roman Catholic Church. So you'll see that a lot on places like the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Brookland. And you'll see that in Romanesque revival architecture. Now, Romanesque revival also is related to another guy named Richardsonian. So sometimes it's called Richardsonian Romanesque. And what it is a very heavy building. It's a style of Victorian architecture. And I think it's important to note that Victorian in our area is used as a generic term for anything sort of that has a particular look, including Romanesque revival. But Victorian is technically a period of time, not an architectural style. So that's really getting pedantic, but what I wanted you to know is that Romanesque revival is a type of Victorian architecture, and it's particularly known for being used for monumental architecture. It'll have very thick, very heavy bricks around or stone around it. It will have usually a bay window with a conical top, so a round top that comes to a point at the top, and it will have little tiny columns on either side of the arch that are sort of truncated columns is what they call them. And this very heavy feeling and very settled on the ground feeling is what you get with Romanesque revival architecture. It's one of my absolute favorite styles because it's very ornate and it's very heavy and it's very cool and very expensive when it was built. So it was a sign that the people that bought it were well-to-do and well-educated.
So you just said something interesting, which is that Victorian, which is a term we all throw around to describe neighborhoods or houses, is actually not an architectural term. It is just a term of time.
Well, it is an architectural term because it tells you the time period in which it was, which would technically be during the reign of Queen Victoria. But most of the time in Washington, if you're not a real history architecture nerd like I am, I know what you mean. If you say it's a Victorian house, I have an idea of what it probably is, even though that's not technically correct. And that's really getting into fine details that I think most people really don't care about. But, if you're a nerd, then you'll really care about that sort of stuff.
So I often associate that term with closer in parts of Capitol Hill. According to an actual person who knows what they're talking about, i.e. you, what am I looking at when I'm walking around those streets?
So a lot of those are what we refer to in the generic sense as a Victorian. So in our area, when we refer to Victorians as an agent or as a normal pedestrian walking by, it'll be a tall, narrowish building that has a bay window attached to it that sort of has a little bit of detailing to it that's a little more elaborate than what you would find on something like a federal style, which would be very plain fronted and flat. So the Victorian will have a little more frou-frou details added onto it, even though, again, it's not technically Victorian. It would be a particular subtype. It would be something like Queen Anne or Italianate or some other type of architectural style that is also now sort of under the heading of Victorian, including Romanesque revival.
So when you're walking around the hill, for instance, almost everything you see will be Victorian in the sense that it was built when Queen Victoria was the Queen of England. But within those, you'll see a lot of difference among these styles you've just mentioned.
Actually, a lot of the Victorians that are in DC were built after Queen Victoria died. I believe she died in 1901. I'd have to double check the exact year that she passed away. But a lot of the buildings that you'll see there were built in the early teens and 20s on Capitol Hill. So they weren't technically Victorians either. But it's sort of like the Center Hall Colonial, which you hear referred to a lot in Washington, which again is not a term. Colonial is not a term because that's a period of time, not an architectural style. So it would be either Georgian or Federal, but we refer to it as a Center Hall Colonial because it's just, normal people don't care about these little minor distinctions.
Right. And I guess they were just behind the times on the Hill, calling them Victorian, even though she'd been dead for 18 years.
Right, exactly.
But let's come in a little bit closer to our time. You've talked about Beaux-Art on your Instagram.
Yes.
What is that? Where can I find it?
So Beaux-Art it's interesting because I think that you'll find that Federal style houses were considered passé for a period of time. And architecture transitioned from that for a short period into a Greek revival, which was very white as opposed to the red brick. And then it went into Victorianism, which is generally very dark and brooding and sort of set down, and will have a lot of variations in the features of the building where it's not necessarily symmetrical. So Victorians will generally not be symmetrical. They will be intentionally asymmetrical buildings. And then there was a movement away from that at the turn of the 20th century. So when we moved from the 19th to the 20th century, there's a movement away from Victorianism, which was dark and brooding, to something that was light and modern. And that light, modern feel is Beaux-Art. And Beaux-Art is defined generally by being a limestone building that's divided into three parts, like a column. So it'll have the base, the column, and the entablature. It'll be divided into three parts. It'll be symmetrical, and it will have a lot of exuberant architectural details to it. So it's a little fancier, a little more upscale than what you would see in sort of design today. It would be considered very fussy compared to modern architectural designs now. Where would you see it? Well, the Museum of Natural History from the Smithsonian is Beaux-Art. And usually Beaux-Art would be on buildings, apartment buildings. For instance, there's a building called the Mendota, which is in Calorama, and the Mendota is in the Beaux-Art style. And that building is a lovely, lovely building, and you can see the beautiful limestone at the bottom, and you can see the brickwork is beautiful and lovely detail with what's called a cornice at the top, which is an extension of the roof, sort of extending beyond the face of the brick of the building. And you'll also see that in a lot of the houses that are along Embassy Row. So Embassy Row has a lot of those houses as well. And again, it was a movement away from the dark, brooding, Victorian dark colors to white, modern colors with a little more symmetry and a little more modernity to them at the turn of the 20th century.
So my understanding of Embassy Row is that was kind of where the tycoons had their Washington outposts. And then
exactly.
Eventually the tycoon families couldn't afford to keep them up anymore. And it just happened to be when a lot of new countries were independent. So that was an easy transition. That
is a very good summary. It was called Millionaires Row for a long time because that's where all the millionaires, which would be the equivalent of billionaires today, were along that row and they would only be in Washington for several weeks during the social season in Washington. And then they'd go off to wherever the next part of the social season was, at the Breakers up in Newport, Rhode Island, or in New York, or wherever else they were going to go off to. So yeah, it's sort of fascinating to see some of those amazing houses along Massachusetts Avenue that are Beaux-Art, that you realize that people had them built to be there for 2 to 3 weeks a year. And then the rest of the time it was vacant.
It's amazing. Although just off Massachusetts Avenue, you can find Zuckerberg's house. And I think it's exactly the same.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. You've also talked about Art Deco. So where do I find that in DC? What is it?
So Art Deco was, again, a sort of a different response to Victorianism. Victorianism, which was very overly elaborate, and Art Deco was part of a movement towards the machine age. And you'll see really modern materials like stainless steel attached to those. And the most opulent of the Art Deco buildings in Washington would be the Kennedy Warren. The Kennedy Warren is right near the National Zoo, and it's a spectacular, spectacular building. And if you go there, what's really interesting about that building in particular is that it was built in two phases, once in the 1920s, and then again later, it was built in the 2000s, because the original plan was to have two wings, but they only had the money to build one of the wings, and then it was stayed with only one wing for almost 80 years, and then they built the second wing. And if you go to it, you can't even tell the difference because the quality of work to match the two together is spectacular. So Art Deco is known for being very vertical and very angular and having modern material, most particularly stainless steel, and to have chrome and to have sort of a machine age view to it. In New York, the famous building would, of course, be the Chrysler Building, which has all that stainless steel at the top, and it's chrome, and these are the sorts of things that would be very much attributed to Art Deco, and it was very high glamour in the 1920s, and you'll see a lot of Hollywood, especially in things like film noir. You'll see a lot of deco, and there's another famous movie, Metropolis, which Metropolis was the first robot movie, and that movie is all about Art Deco. It's a very cool architectural style. And there are other buildings in the city that are like that too, like the General Scott at 1 Scott Circle. There's not a lot of Art Deco houses, although the house that was built for the Kayfritzes, who are major developers in DC, is an Art Deco house, and it's now where one of the field school is off of Vauxhall Road.
One last building question, because I want to go on to some kind of styles of houses in DC.
Sure.
The Cairo. I've always been fascinated with that building. It was the tallest building in Washington, but it's got a kind of Orientalist vibe about it on the outside.
Moroccan,
I think the name fits that too.
So the Cairo was built by T.F. Schneider, who was most well known for building in the Romanesque Revival style. He was a developer in D.C. in the early 1900s, very prolific. And that was called Schneider's Folly when it was built because nobody thought it would be successful. It was built as a hotel to start. And it was built and modeled off of the Transportation Museum from the World Columbian Exposition in 1894. And if you were to ever take a look at the picture of the front door of the Columbian Exposition, you'll see that is an exact replica on the Cairo. And that surrounding portion is sort of a Moorish influence. And so that intricate detail work, again, replicated from the building at the Columbian Exposition. The reason why it's called the Cairo is that T.F. Schneider copied the Transportation Building, which was located on Cairo Street at the World Columbian Exposition. So he took that name and added it to the building. It's got a very controversial record amongst architectural snobs because architectural snobs think that it's not a very well conceived building. It's got a lot of mishmash added on there. And when you look at it as a whole, it's very cool. But if you start looking at the individual elements, it's not really well executed.
For people who are out there trying to buy a house in DC, you'll see listings, and there's some phrases that come up a lot on these listings, and I want you to explain to me what they mean. Sherman Cottage.
Okay, so Sherman Cottage is a very cool architectural style, and it's found only in Cleveland Park, and it's a Washington, D.C. only architectural style. And the reason why it came to be is that the Cleveland Park neighborhood was being developed by a guy named John Sherman. And John Sherman's initial plan was to hire world-famous architects from the world and bring them into Cleveland Park and have them design houses in a variety of eclectic styles. The first phase was done in that style, but by the second phase, the architects were not coming. So he hired his wife, who was also named Sherman, and she designed this particular style that's a sort of combination of arts and crafts style and Victorianism, and it's unique in DC, and it's very, very cool. It's traditionally known for having a particular kind of window, which is the diamond-paned window, and it would have what's called a jerkin head roof, which is, if you imagine a traditional colonial which has a pointed roof, that's what most people think when they draw a house. If you clip off the front and you make a little dog ear on it, that's called a jerkin head roof, and that's what they're most known for. It's a beautiful architectural style, and they're really cool, and you definitely have to go check them out in Cleveland Park.
What about porch front?
Okay, so porch front is almost as if it's a federal style house. It was really brought about by a particular developer named Harry Wardman. Harry Wardman would design these houses that have a very plain front, but would then have a front porch added to the front of it. You'll see many, many, many thousands of examples of that, particularly if you go to Petworth as one of the neighborhoods. If you go up to Brightwood, you'll see them there. You'll see them all over Northeast DC as well. And so Brookland, other areas in the city. And what they are, a series of row houses, generally in the neighborhood of around 10 to 12 at a time. And they would be very flat in the front with a big front porch to welcome people in and for people to sit out during the summer months so they could talk to their neighbors and everything before the days of air conditioning and be a little bit cooler. They're one of the most classic styles in DC.
Well, right. And so many people claim to live in Wardman houses. I've read that he actually didn't make that many of them.
Well, so at the time when he was a developer, at one point, 10% of the people that lived in DC lived in a property he built. And he was known for building in a very high quality. We did a video together a while back over at a building called the Northumberland for your wonderful channel. And when we did that, we got a chance to see some of his most beautiful work. But he is known for building very high quality construction, even if it's not terribly fancy. And these porch front styles were a style he invented that then later became associated with his name. So the term Wardman is kind of like the term Kleenex, which is, all facial tissues people call Kleenex, even though they're not the same brand. It's the same thing. So Wardman is a particular style, even if it was not necessarily built by Wardman himself.
And you said Wardman, he's not an architect. He was a developer. He was a guy amassing plots.
Correct. He was a developer. He hired architects. One of his most famous architects that he hired was a guy called Mesrobian. And Mesrobian designed the unbelievably gorgeous Art Deco building called Sedgwick Gardens that's in Cleveland Park. And it is spectacular. Last thing I'll say about Mesrobian, he was the last architect for the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And when the Armenian genocide happened, he fled. His family, unfortunately, was killed during the genocide. But when he fled to the United States, he started working for Harry Wardman and created some of the most beautiful buildings in DC.
So if I'm walking down a street, how can I tell if it's a Wardman or just something that someone was like copying his style?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And anyone can do some really cool research on their own. You can go to a website called HistoryQuest DC. And if you go to HistoryQuest DC, you can put in an address and a map will zoom in and it will pull up the permits for who the architect was, who the developer was for pretty much every property in Washington, DC. It's a really cool resource and anyone can use it. In fact, I use it frequently myself, and it's really a fascinating way to look. And sometimes you'll be on a block where you'll see 4 houses that'll all look the same, and then you'll look at them actually and who designed them. They were designed by 4 different people. It's really a wonderful resource. So that's how you can find it there. Or go to the DC History Center. The DC History Center has what's called the Kiplinger Library, and you can do your house history there. It's fascinating. The librarian there is amazing. The whole DC History Center is amazing, and you should definitely go check that out. It's in a Beaux-Arts building, and it's in the old Carnegie Library, where the Apple store is, the main Apple store at 801 K Street in the center of the city. On the 3rd floor is the DC History Center and their library to do research. You can go there. Last suggestion would be to go to the Washingtoniana division at the Martin Luther King Jr. Library that's run by the DC Public Library. You can find research there as well.
So wait, why did that style take off so much in DC?
The Wardman porch front took off because it was an affordable way to build, and zoning law allowed them to be built that way. So it was really a reaction to the zoning codes in DC. Because if you look particularly in row houses, the row houses that you see, the change from Victorianism to these porch front houses, the difference is the way they're constructed, the shapes of the lots. And that was determined by zoning. So there was actually a lot of complaint from the DC Council back when Wardman was building, and they kept complaining to him, asking him why he was constantly building the same style of house. And he said, because you make the same zoning codes. You give me the zoning codes, that's what I will build. So one of the reasons why they transitioned from that Victorian style to the porch front was because they changed the zoning codes, and that because the change in zoning codes allowed them to build in a new style, people really wanted to be in a modern house. Much like today, people buy these modern houses that, 20 years ago would not have been built this way because zoning codes have changed and taste has changed. And that's why people like these houses the way they are now.
So I wanted to ask about that a little bit, because the city is in the middle of an argument about the land use plan and what should be allowed where. You go to a nice Victorian neighborhood, and my sense is that a lot of that would have been illegal for much of the past 50 years. It would have violated various zoning codes. And as a result, this neighborhood that I think most people agree is quite pretty doesn't get to be built anymore. What sort of constraints either allow or don't allow some of these styles that you have just outlined now in the year 2026?
Well, I think that in general, all of the styles could still be built. What's really happened for the city is, particularly in Ward 3, Upper Northwest Washington, the zoning there requires that it's detached single-family homes. And because of that, you don't have the row houses that you have in neighborhoods like Petworth, et cetera. And that's really a reflection of the developers trying to both maximize lots and to sell to the wealthiest people possible because they can get more money from wealthy people. Much like you see developers today don't build affordable housing, they build luxury condos. So every time there's a new condo development, it's luxury condos. And why is that? That's because the developers can make more money. And why is that? That's because the zoning codes encourage that sort of development. So I think that what we're missing in DC is the ability to put in more what are called ADUs or accessory dwelling units in detached neighborhoods. There's a lot of push against that sort of thing from neighborhoods. The other thing we're missing is the ability to mix in commercial with residential. So you go to Georgetown, and one of the things that's charming about Georgetown is that you can see there are some small, like Stacalchi's sandwich shop that's in Georgetown. I think it's on P Street, and it's sort of mixed in with the residential neighborhood. And an area like that has these sort of mixed in smaller places within the community, which is really important. Another example of that would be in Chevy Chase, DC. You can see right across from the Lafayette Elementary School, they've got a Chevy Chase Market there, which is a house that's allowed to be a market. So families gather there to get groceries. It's sort of a convenience store almost, but it's also a neighborhood meeting place and mixing pot, which is really important for that neighborhood. And it's the only one that's in Chevy Chase. If there were more opportunities for that, the city would be a significantly better and more pleasant place to live.
There was one other kind of house on my list that I wanted to ask you about. Lind, I don't even know how you say it. Lind?
Lindy, yes. The Lindy house is a very unique style of architecture. Lindy was a developer, Barry Lindy, he was a developer in DC, and he came up with a sort of pattern in the mid-century, the 1950s and 60s. It's a sort of a modern interpretation of federal-style row houses. But what makes a Lindy unique is the way that he designed it, because he knew that a lot of the people buying in the city didn't have a lot of money. So he designed it to look like a single family home. But when you walk in the front door, you could turn to the right and there'd be a separate one-bedroom apartment that you could rent out, and then the family could live above. And if the family then had more money later, they would then take over that ground floor unit, take down the wall, and make it a single family home. And has a very particular style, which is, again, it looks like a sort of modern interpretation of a federal row house. And a lot of people called it phony colony because it sort of looks like almost a colonial. And in fact, Barack Obama lived in one of them before he became president. While he was a member of Congress, he lived in a Lindy.
What neighborhood do I find them?
That was on Capitol Hill. And you'll see them on Capitol Hill. That's where Lindy started. But you'll see them also in DuPont, and you'll see them in Adams Morgan in Northwest. He basically did them as infill projects when the city was in rough shape financially. He built these houses to bring people into the city.
That last question I've got, and maybe it's a big one, but there are so many reasons you build a house in a certain way. In Washington, there was ideas. You mentioned the federal era. They wanted to show, we're our own country now. This is our own thing. There's money. Some stuff's more expensive. There's the law. There's the weather. What does all this add up to over its history? Like what was built here that wasn't built elsewhere that's really striking to people?
Well, I think the most important thing to know about Washington is that Washington has always been relatively to the major cities of the East Coast, a poor city. So you compare it to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore even was a much wealthier city for much of the United States history. Or you go down to Atlanta. A lot of these places could afford to have professional architects doing the work. And Washington, D.C. generally was done by local architects who were not as formally trained as you would have been if you'd been in New York. The easiest example of that would be Beaux-Arts architecture. A lot of the Beaux-Arts in DC is not truly Beaux-Arts. It's sort of a variation because the architects here would look in pattern books and so, I like that detail. I'll add it into my Victorian. So it's got these sort of weird hybrids of things going on in Washington. There's a joke about Washington architecture, which is Washington is the city where the world's best architects go to do their worst work. Like the Mies van der Rohe, there's only one Mies van der Rohe building, which is the Martin Luther King Jr. Library. Which
I kind of figure he phoned that one in. Huh?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's been a bunch of that. There's a couple of exceptions, of course. I.M. Pei's East Wing of the National Gallery of Art is exceptional architecture. There are some of these things, but I think what you find in Washington, the most important thing that separates Washington from other cities is the lack of skyscrapers. That is the thing that really separates it. And that is due to the building that you mentioned earlier. The Cairo is the reason why there's a height restriction. People were so horrified by a 14-story building. They're like, we have to put a cap on the height of buildings. So the Cairo is the reason why there's a height restriction in DC. And that's what makes the architecture here different from anywhere else in the United States.
Joe, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. And call me back anytime. It's really so much fun to talk about architecture. And I know we've nerded out, but I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
And before we go, thank you to our new neighbors, Adam A. and Catherine C. Plus, we've got some neighborhood shout-outs. Elizabeth D. loves Civic on 8th, a new Black woman-owned cafe that has nailed it on so many fronts. Delish coffee, amazing pastries from Souk, and great natural light. Anna Claire W. is shouting out Art Sound Language, the record store in the only historic Victorian arcade in Washington, D.C. And Gregory E. thinks Baked by Yael has the best bagels in D.C., chewy on the inside and crunchy on the outside. If you want to become a CityCast DC neighbor, head to membership.citycast.fm and sign up. It is only $10 a month. Listeners get ad-free listening, a members-only events newsletter, and super secret members events. Again, that's membership.citycast.fm. And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We will be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.